Okay. So, another one of them longtime favorites for a lot of people. Lord of the Ring. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised and definitely more impressed playing it solo than I was in my one opposed game of it. I'm a so-so fan of the storyline, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and all that. Which is to say, I've read it a few times and have certain feelings about it, etc. And this is not, I think, the game that best captures the story, but so far I'm happiest with the Fellowship of the Ring. Not in terms of being scripted and staying to the story, but staying within the realm of the story. What happens in the books strangely doesn't portray well as a military simulation. That is to say, the dark powers are always failing in the books. I mean, they may have hordes and hordes of troops all over the place, but they never take anything. They never really succeed. Except you could say Sharky in the Shire. At least he temporarily succeeded in taking something. But most of the rest of it is almost seems like if you tried to portray it as a military game, all them orcs and trolls and Dunlendings and Easterlings, hordes and hordes of them, just ain't strong enough to take anything. Not when you start throwing the characters into the mix. Fellowship cuts away from all of that by saying, okay, let's just concentrate on the one important factor, the ring. If the ring makes it to Mount Doom, it's over. If Sauron's able to capture the ring, it's over. And that's really the point of view of the story, is that, oh my God, we're doomed unless we get rid of the ring. Unless we succeed in this one mission. And anything outside of that mission is really kind of secondary. The citadels and cities can kind of hold out and this, that, and the other. You don't have to worry about it in that game. This game doesn't follow that. In fact, the old SPI game of the same name does a better job, which is to say the free people can kind of withstand whatever mighty armies Sauron can throw at them, and actually, as in the book, eventually turn the tide at the end. If you look at the story, Gandalf and Aragorn are leading their armies, including the dead men and whatever, right up to the gates of Morannon, and they break them, and Gandalf breaks them, and they just defeat it. And likewise, with a little help from the Ents, which seemed like a minor thing in the game, but seemed more important in the story. You wouldn't necessarily want something that's a random event to have that huge an effect, though. It's a big enough effect. They take down Saruman fairly easily. But what this game sort of captures, looking at it from the Fellowship and Free People side, is this feeling of doom that persists in the book. So without matching or even maybe making possible the events of the book, fighting to a stalemate, etc., if the military is really becoming engaged, it actually captures a lot of the spirit of the book, which is, oh, we're screwed. Um, when you start thinking about the book as a war game, and you look at the SPI game and consider it in that way, you kind of get this, gosh, why are they so worried about the ring anyway? They could just defeat Sauron. Maybe Boromir was right, Okay, maybe it'll corrupt. Great. But one of the things this game manages to do very well, I think, is to make you feel like, oh shit, I've got to get that ring there. Now you've got some kind of chance, very, very limited, as the Fellowship player, if the Sauron player's not careful, if he's stupid, of winning a military victory, I assume. The Sauron player uses the military victory as a threat in this game. And what you don't know in the books is, hey, what happens with Thranduil? Is he being put under pressure, etc.? But his troops actually show up, I think, towards the end of the trilogy, along with Dane and Bard the Third and all these people. They show up. They've won in their sector too. The only place where a loss happens is with Sharky, and that's only temporary. So, in terms of remaining true to the story, I think this game actually fails because it makes the Sauron military victory very much a real threat. As a game, that's a very good thing, though. It's one of the problems with the SPI one, is it stays too strict to where the story actually goes. Not in any scripting sort of sense. You're still free to go wherever you want, but you just ain't got the troops to take Minas Tirith, and you probably can't take Helm's Deep. You probably are going to lose these big battles. If you get lucky, you manage to take out, say, Rohan. But it's a tough task ahead of you. In this game, the overwhelming hordes, if you capitalize on that military advantage, are really capable of winning the game. And that's what we saw, is the Sauron player was able to throw his armies into play with enough effort that, well, if the Fellowship hadn't been as close as they were, that's what it would have come down to. So that's one interesting aspect of this. As a game itself, I think it works very, very well. It shows something, the same kind of feeling that I get out of kind of a Twilight Struggle. Except in Twilight Struggle, you've got this clear balance you're trying to keep. And by what I mean, the same kind of feeling is, as long as you kind of play carefully, you feel like you're in it and you've got this shot, and as it develops and comes down towards the end, you realize, wow, it's going to come down to the wire. Now, obviously, I'm sure it's possible for someone to completely outplay someone else, but with me playing both sides, it ended up feeling fairly balanced there. There's some very clever mechanisms in here, with the dice rolls for the actions, where you don't really know what you're going to be able to do, but you have some control over it. Then all the event cards, this sort of additional options. Do you want to use these event cards? Do you want to save them for battle? Do you want to use your dice up on the event cards? Or do you need to move your people? Do you need to move the Fellowship? For the Sauron player, obviously, how many dice do you want to put in the hunt pool? That changes throughout the game. You may not be able to control some of those changes. For example, as the Fellowship gets smaller, you're starting to say, well, can't really search anymore. That's because, and it makes sense. It's because the Sauron player's chasing those other hobbits down or whatever. Actually killing these characters off probably would indicate maybe a more capability for focusing on the one hobbit. There's one kind of weird thing, which is that I'm more used to it on this second playing, but the Fellowship chart with, hey, you don't really know where the Fellowship is as the free people's player. In a sense, the leaders of the army of that don't really know where it's at, though. So you're kind of taking it from their point of view. But what's weird about it is the Lan, or 4000 AD, paradigm of, yeah, I'm moving somewhere. I haven't decided where yet. I don't know which direction I'm going to land in. And you have more flexibility in this. You don't actually have to go the full distance. That's kind of odd, to say the least. It's a little disconcerting, and I think that's part of what threw me. I felt like that was too gamey. But it's bothering me less on the second play. The things that really did kind of get in the way, though, it's kind of sad to say. First of all, the damn minis. I would prefer a game without minis. They don't add anything to the game for me. Visually, some good counters like the ones in Maharaja or in the Great Battles of History. But something like Maharaja where it's kind of big and you can see the image on it. It'll help you visualize. So these would be really cool painted. They'd be cool looking, and I've seen people's sets that are painted, and that's fantastic and everything. But that's not, the game doesn't come with painted minis, unless, I guess, if you get the designer's edition. What it comes with is a bunch of plastic pieces that are very hard to distinguish in some cases, that clutter the board. The board is huge for what it contains, but still too small to have piles and piles of plastic armies on it. There's some way around that, which is these little discs, a la Axis and Allies. But, if the whole game was little discs and they had pictures of what they had on them, that would work too. And those pictures could be more distinguishable. And then finally, of course, the just ultimate worst thing, which is the Nazgul. They apparently get smaller from what I'm told in the second edition. Also, component-wise, a change that the second edition, I'm assured, is better. These cards are almost unreadable to me. I mean, I have to go under the light and try to find my perfect position, because my eyes are not so good anymore. They're very not so good. I mean, they've never been good, but now they're not so good at close stuff. Kind of like the artwork on the backs of the character cards, though. Although that, too, doesn't make it trivial to align them with the miniatures for the different characters. Again, counters would have been easier to use. Another option, and this I could do myself, is to put a little strip underneath with who it is. I was told with the Nazgul, a lot of the people who have this edition will glue a nickel to it to give it some weight on the bottom so they don't just topple over all the time. Sure. Other than that, and remembering the cards in your hand, that's more of a gameplay thing. But it doesn't help that there's so much text on them and that it's so tiny. But it is tough with a handful of 6 cards, each of which has 2 options on it. One is the event, one is the battle card, to really figure out what you want to do and remember it. That gets a lot harder when you're playing solitaire. The rules themselves are also somewhat difficult. They're not bad in most cases, but there were a couple of places where things just didn't come across to me very clearly. Most notably, not in this playthrough, but the first time I played it, in the use of the hunting dice and how they work. The simple fact that every time the Fellowship moves, that generates a hunt effect. I'm not sure, I mean, the rules are all correct there. There's no ambiguity in them. It's just the impression that I got was different. Like there'd be a search phase or something like that. There'd be a single search. Not every time the Fellowship moves, it triggers a search. That may more be my preconceptions from the old SPI game. Thinking the way Board Game Geek and a lot of, the general essence of this game is that game. That this was actually essentially a redesign of it. And it's put down as the prior addition to this, or it used to be, I don't know. Maybe they pulled that because it is bullshit that it is. They share a definite common ancestry of thought, and there's no question that whoever designed this had seen that and it said, "Oh, but I can do it so much better." But that's similar to saying, "Here I Stand" is a Mighty Fortress redone. Unfortunately, there are some games like Imperium by GDW. I have the old version up there that apparently got completely rewritten as totally different games, but kept the same name. That's weird, and they kept the same, copyright, essentially. What else can I say about this? What strikes me as especially clever here? Let me look at the sequence of play to think a little bit about it. The play of the event deck isn't that exciting. That's not something new. I think the big new thing in this, the thing that really drives this game and makes it special, are the dice. And they're beautiful, by the way. I mean, you can look at the playthrough. The regular ones are just nice, high quality, the combat dice. But these guys, the action dice, are really a lovely texture, etc. And they have these little symbols that make them a little hard to read. Those could have been, I think, more clearly handled. I'm not sure. But the whole mechanism of rolling to see what things you can do and then assigning them to your different units as you play is kind of neat. It leads me to the thought of rolling a bunch of dice. Well, it's not just to your units, it's to your actions. So, the character actions use one thing, the army actions, there's a couple of different options there. You can use character actions to move armies if you have a leader. Just all these integrated pieces that just mesh together in a way that seems to work really, really nicely. And when you start adding the other factors, it also seems to work really nicely. Clearly, though, with the events, with the characters, although you have them as open information, and just the style of play, this is a game that more experience is going to give you a real edge in, I think. There may be a leveling off point, once you kind of know the cards, once you've played 10, 12 games of this. But I don't do that, right? So I can't really talk too much about the quality of it over the long term, but I can look at the fact that, well, obviously the franchise, at least by the second edition, ends up really, really winning over a strong group of players. All right, let's look. The whole hunt dice, wow, that's kind of a weird thing, right? They change their means of play, but again, it works well in terms of representing the amount of effort that's spent towards the hunt as opposed to moving the armies. It works well in terms of creating problems for the fellowship player. The more dice you put in there, he's going to have some serious problems if there's a big pile in there, because whenever he moves, if you've got enough dice in there, you're going to get a trigger on him and be able to do something. And if you put your maximal dice in there throughout the early stages of the game, you might have a chance of really flattening the fellowship so that, well, maybe they'll lose characters or not be able to push on as fast, having to heal and learn or whatever. And that'll give you the opportunity to win back the time that you spent with all those dice. And then they take on a somewhat different role when you get into Mordor itself, where they may or may not be important. Your big armies searching may cause damage, but they may just miss completely based on the tile you draw. The search tiles, those seem to work pretty well. It surprised me how few of them there are, sort of. That would have been one of my feelings. I'm actually kind of interested in the expansion for this, too. But that goes for a fortune. I got lucky, I guess. Not incredibly lucky. I mean, it is first edition, kind of iffy. But, I got it at a reasonable price. The alternating the actions, that usually isn't a good thing for me. I know a lot of people like that kind of, I take a move, you take a move, I take a move, you take a move, on just one item. What gets kind of wrong with it is, well, if you get a lot of movement rolls, one unit can move fairly far across the map. You can focus on one thing. You can't focus on the fellowship because that'll screw with your hunt chances. Because the fellowship player, every time he moves, his die goes into the pool and adds an X, usually as a modifier until you get into Moria. The victory conditions, well, the core ones with the ring make perfect sense. But again, I think that the military victory conditions end up driving the game better than they do in this game's only real competitor, which is the SPI one. Not a lot else I can say about it. I don't know how much needs to be said. Again, a second playing, not screwing up, not having to work as hard for the rules, definitely helped my impression of it. I still don't understand the enjoyment of plastic minis unless you're painting them. I know people who do not paint their minis, like me, but won't play anything unless it has, real pieces, not counters on the board. But this is a game that, in my view, would definitely get an advantage as to the counters. I'd worry a little bit about the multiplayer game. Not so much with, say Sauron or the Fellowship kind of coming to this, trying to delay until they're in a better position as that power, but more the possibility of foot dragging with a Fellowship victory, trying to slow that down so that you have more time to maybe do your military victory. That would be troublesome indeed to me, I think. Anyway, you can see why the game is as popular as it is. It's not really right up my alley because of that pulsed actions doesn't solo as well as some other games, but it provides the same kind of dynamic of quicker paced actions, more decisions per action, etc., that something like a Twilight Struggle does, that some of the more popular CDGs do. And it's still a fairly light game. Didn't take too long either. And it was kind of fun to come back to. Like, I would play a turn, and I'd kind of I always need to walk away after a turn, but I kind of come right back very shortly afterwards. That's a nice sign. A lot of games recently, I've not been feeling that. I've been feeling the kind of, it's, I mean, maybe I needed something like this. Sometimes I do. And I definitely took some enjoyment out of it. And here I am, tired, babbling way too much. So let's end it up.